The galaxy stretched endlessly, its stars scattered like uncountable specks of light across a vast, dark void, a stark reminder of the enormity of space and the smallness of life within it. Among its countless civilizations, a shared belief held firm: life was the ultimate victor over adversity. But that belief was shattered when the virus came. It began subtly, an ominous whisper in the cosmic wind. Reports trickled in from the outer fringes of the Milky Way. Entire ecosystems were collapsing on planets where flora and fauna had thrived for millennia. Societies rich with history and culture vanished almost overnight, leaving their cities eerily silent. Scientists and leaders from every corner of the galaxy scrambled for answers, their desperation uniting them in unprecedented collaboration. The virus, however, proved ruthless and unyielding. It mutated faster than anyone could comprehend, targeting every known species with chilling precision. On Earth, the news was met with a mix of horror and disbelief. Humanity had always been the underdog in galactic affairs, a young species often dismissed for its modest technology and biologically fragile nature. Their immune systems, in particular, were considered laughably primitive by galactic standards. Yet, as the death toll rose and entire species faced extinction, a curious anomaly emerged: humans remained unaffected. For Dr. Elena Carter, a xenobiologist working at the Galactic Health Coalition's research outpost on Titan, the situation was both baffling and terrifying. She stared at the holographic display in her lab, her brow furrowed as data streams blinked across the screen. Every test confirmed the same thing: the virus, which they'd named Salivera, seemed to bypass human biology entirely. This was unprecedented. No other species, from the smallest microbial life to the most advanced sentient beings, had shown even a hint of immunity. The scientific community was stunned, grappling with the sheer improbability of humanity's unique resilience, and the implications for survival were staggering. It was as though it didn't even recognize them as living organisms. Elena pushed a lock of auburn hair behind her ear and glanced at her colleague, Dr. Kess Lurth, a towering Thranian with iridescent scales. Kess was uncharacteristically subdued, their usual vibrant hues dulled to a muted green, a sign of stress in their species. "It's impossible," Kess muttered, their voice a low rumble. "Every species shares at least some biological markers. Even you humans have overlapping traits with others. This virus should have affected you. And yet, here we are," Elena replied, her voice tinged with unease. She tapped the display, pulling up a comparative analysis of the virus's effects on various species. "Every test we've run shows the same result. Salivera doesn't just ignore human cells, it actively avoids them. Like we're invisible to it." Kess's golden eyes narrowed. "Invisibility can't be natural. Something in your biology is repelling it. If we can isolate that factor, we might have a way to save the others," Elena finished, though her tone was far from optimistic. The enormity of the task loomed over them. Salivera was unlike anything they'd encountered, a virus so advanced it behaved almost intelligently. Time was running out. The outpost's intercom crackled to life, interrupting their thoughts. "Dr. Carter, Dr. Lurth, report to the main briefing room immediately." The voice was clipped, authoritative. General Arik Voss, the human military liaison, didn't tolerate delays. Elena exchanged a glance with Kess before they both hurried to the briefing room. The tension in the air was palpable as they entered. Representatives from various species filled the room, their faces, or equivalent facial structures, etched with worry. At the center of the room stood Voss, his imposing figure clad in the dark uniform of the United Earth Fleet. Beside him was a holographic projection of the galaxy, with red markers indicating the spread of Salivera. Nearly half the galaxy was now infected. "We have a situation," Voss began, his deep voice commanding attention. "The virus is accelerating. At its current rate, we estimate total galactic extinction within 6 months. A murmur of dread rippled through the room. Elena felt her stomach knot. 6 months. That wasn't enough time to find a cure, let alone distribute it. Voss continued, "Our scientists have confirmed that humans are immune. This puts us in a unique position. The Galactic Council has authorized a mission to transport key research teams to Earth, where they'll have access to our resources and protection." "Protection," A frail voice rasped. It belonged to Selrua Ven, an elder from the Zynaran race, whose once lustrous plumage now hung in sickly clumps. From what? Voss's jaw tightened. Desperation breeds chaos. Riots have erupted on several planets, with survivors blaming humanity for the virus. On the trade hub of Cyrinth, mobs burned human-owned establishments, while on Elora Prime, protests escalated into violent clashes with local security forces. Reports of targeted assassinations and sabotage against human envoys have begun to trickle in, adding a new layer of peril to an already dire situation. Entire research facilities have been attacked, and whispers of covert retaliation schemes are spreading. There are factions that believe humanity's immunity is not natural. That we created this virus as a bioweapon. The room erupted into a cacophony of voices. Accusations and denials flew back and forth, species blaming each other for the catastrophe. Elena felt a surge of anger and frustration. The galaxy was falling apart, and they were squabbling like children. Enough! Voss bellowed, slamming his fist onto the table. The room fell silent. Pointing fingers won't save anyone. What matters is finding a solution. And that starts with understanding why humans are immune. Elena raised her hand, drawing the general's attention. General, if I may. We've been running tests on human samples, but we're working blind. We need more data, including genetic and environmental factors. If there's something unique about humanity, it might not just be biological. It could be cultural or even psychological. Voss nodded. You'll have what you need. The transport ship leaves in 6 hours. I expect you both to be on it. Kessa's scales darkened. You expect me to abandon my people? I expect you to do your duty, Voss shot back. If you want to save them, this is the only way. Elena placed a hand on Kessa's arm. We'll find answers, she said softly. I promise. The Thranian hesitated before giving a reluctant nod. Together, they began preparations for the journey to Earth. The hours passed in a blur as they packed equipment, samples, and research notes. Elena's shoulders tensed, the enormity of the mission making every breath feel heavier. Each glance at their packed equipment reminded her of the countless lives depending on their success. The fate of innumerable species hinged on their progress, each moment bringing them closer to salvation or oblivion. As the transport ship lifted off, Elena gripped the armrest, her pulse quickening with a mix of dread and determination. She glanced at Kess, whose muted scales reflected the dim cabin light, seeking a shared sense of resolve. They had always seemed so full of promise, a testament to the boundless potential of life. Now, they felt cold and distant, a reminder of how fragile that life truly was. We'll fix this, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. We have to. Beside her, Kess remained silent, their gaze fixed on the dark expanse ahead. Neither of them knew what awaited them on Earth, but the path ahead promised trials that would test their resilience and ingenuity in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The journey to Earth, though brief in the grand scale of galactic travel, felt interminable to Elena. The steady thrum of the ship's engines filled the cabin, a constant presence as Elena wrestled with the flood of thoughts threatening to overwhelm her. Each passing hour brought new updates from the Galactic Health Coalition. A colony of 5 million was now silent, its inhabitants gone without a trace. Another report described how a team of researchers on Halvora succumbed mid-broadcast, their final moments captured in horrifying detail. Entire planets were succumbing to the virus, their populations extinguished with horrifying speed. The devastation stretched across star systems, entire cities reduced to silent ruins, their streets littered with the belongings of those who vanished, orbital stations floated adrift, their crews succumbed to the virus without warning, leaving only automated distress signals in the void. Kess, seated across from her in the cramped cabin, was equally restless. Their claws tapped rhythmically on the datapad, a rare display of nervous energy that contrasted with their usual composed demeanor. Every so often, their frilled crest fluttered slightly, a subtle but telling sign of anxiety among Thranian physiology. Despite their focused expression, the tension in their rigid posture spoke volumes, hinting at the silent weight they carried for their people. The Thranian scales had darkened further, and their usually precise movements were marked with uncharacteristic fidgeting. Every so often, They would glance at the small datapad in their hands, as if willing it to produce answers. Elena could sense the weight of guilt pressing down on them. "We're doing everything we can," she said softly, breaking the silence. "We'll find something. We have to." Kessa's golden eyes flicked up to meet hers. "You don't understand," they said, their voice low. "My people are already on the brink. If we fail," they trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavily between them. Elena didn't know how to respond. What comfort could she offer when the stakes were so high? Instead, she reached across the table and placed a hand on Kessa's arm. The gesture was small, but it seemed to steady them. The ship's intercom crackled to life. "Dr. Carter, Dr. Lurth, we're approaching Earth. Please prepare for descent." Elena withdrew her hand and nodded. "Time to get to work," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. The descent through Earth's atmosphere was rough but uneventful. The ship touched down at a secure facility on the outskirts of New London, a sprawling metropolis that had become the de facto capital of Earth. Elena and Kess were escorted off the ship by a contingent of armed guards, their presence a stark reminder of the tensions surrounding humanity's immunity. Inside the facility, they were greeted by Dr. Raj Patel, the lead scientist for Earth's virology division. Patel was a wiry man with sharp features and an intensity that made Elena instantly feel like she was under a microscope. "Welcome," Patel said briskly, his gaze flicking between Elena and Kess. "We've prepared a lab for you. Time is critical, and we can't afford delays. Let's get straight to it." Elena appreciated his directness. "What's the latest?" she asked as they followed him through the facility's sterile corridors. "Bad," Patel replied. "We're seeing signs that Solivera is adapting. It's starting to break down the immune defenses of previously resistant species. If it figures out how to breach human immunity," he didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. The lab was a marvel of cutting-edge technology, filled with equipment that made Elena's outpost on Titan look archaic by comparison. But there was no time to marvel. She and Kess got to work immediately, diving into the mountains of data that Patel's team had compiled. Hours turned into days as they worked tirelessly, their focus unbroken except for brief moments of sleep snatched in the lab's makeshift bunks. The work was grueling, and progress was agonizingly slow. Solivera was unlike anything they had ever encountered, its structure so complex it defied conventional categorization. But slowly, patterns began to emerge. "Look at this," Elena said one evening, her voice tinged with excitement. She gestured to a holographic projection of the virus's genetic code. "These sequences here, they're behaving like neural pathways. It's almost as if the virus is learning." Kess leaned in, their golden eyes narrowing as they studied the display. "That shouldn't be possible. Viruses aren't sentient." "No, but what if this one is programmed to mimic sentience?" Elena countered. "Think about it. It's targeting specific species, adapting to their biology. What if it's not just a virus? What if it's a weapon?" Kess's scales shifted to a pale gray, a sign of shock. "A weapon designed to wipe out every species except one," they said slowly. "And humanity is immune." Kess's scales remained a pale gray as their gaze flicked to the floor, while Elena's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, her mind racing with unspoken questions. The silence between them carried an unbearable weight, thick with dread and unvoiced fears. A prickling sensation spread across Elena's neck, her pulse quickening as an ominous weight seemed to press against her chest. If Solivera was engineered, then someone or something had created it with a purpose. Elena's breath hitched as a wave of nausea surged through her. Beside her, Kess's claws clenched against the table, leaving faint scratch marks on its surface. The realization hit them both like a physical blow, the gravity of it pressing down with suffocating weight. Their conversation was interrupted by the blare of an alarm. The lab's emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the room in a pulsing red glow. A voice over the intercom announced, "Security breach. All personnel, proceed to lockdown protocols." Elena and Kess exchanged a tense glance. "What now?" Elena muttered, already moving toward the door. Outside the lab, the corridors were a flurry of activity as security teams scrambled to respond to the breach. Patel appeared, his face grim. What's happening? Elena demanded. We've been compromised, Patel said. A group of insurgents managed to infiltrate the facility. They're targeting the lab. Insurgents? Kes repeated, their voice tinged with disbelief. Why would they target us? Because they believe humanity created Solivera, Patel replied. And they're not here to talk. The sound of distant gunfire punctuated his words, sending a jolt of fear through Elena. We need to secure the samples, she said urgently. If they get destroyed. Patel nodded. Follow me. There's a secure vault in the lower levels. We can. Before he could finish, an explosion rocked the facility, the shockwave knocking them off their feet. Elena's ears rang as she scrambled to her knees, her heart pounding. Smoke filled the corridor, and through the haze, she could see shadowy figures approaching. Run! Patel shouted, pulling her to her feet as the deafening roar of explosions echoed down the corridor, mingling with the sharp staccato of gunfire. The acrid smell of burning circuits filled the air, and the distant shouts of the insurgents grew closer, adding to the chaos. Kes was already moving, their powerful frame clearing a path through the chaos. Elena followed, clutching the precious data drive containing their research. The next few minutes were a maelstrom of chaos. Elena's ears throbbed from the unrelenting roar of explosions, her breath catching with each near miss of debris. Kes's claws scraped against the floor as they dragged her forward, their powerful frame shielding her from a hail of sparks. The acrid stench of smoke mixed with the metallic tang of blood in the air, each step through the crumbling corridors feeling like a race against doom. They navigated the labyrinthine corridors, dodging gunfire and debris as the insurgents closed in. Patel led them to a hidden access panel, which opened into a narrow maintenance shaft. This leads to the vault, he said, his voice strained. Go. I'll hold them off. You can't, Elena began, but Patel cut her off. Go, he barked. Kes grabbed her arm and pulled her into the shaft. The last thing she saw before the panel closed was Patel turning to face the approaching insurgents, a determined look in his eyes. The shaft was dark and claustrophobic, the air thick with dust that clung to Elena's throat, making every breath feel laboured. Her palms scraped against the rough metal walls as she steadied herself, the faint echoes of distant gunfire adding to her mounting sense of urgency. Kes's movements ahead were deliberate yet tense, their claws clicking softly against the floor as they led the way through the suffocating passage. Elena's hands trembled as she clutched the data drive, her mind racing. Patel's sacrifice weighed heavily on her, but there was no time to dwell on it. They had to reach the vault and secure the research. The fate of the galaxy depended on it. Elena could barely see her own hands as she and Kes crawled through the maintenance shaft. The air was stifling, clinging to her lungs like a suffocating shroud. The metallic walls seemed to close in tighter with every breath, their cold surfaces brushing her skin and amplifying her sense of entrapment. Every sound seemed unnervingly sharp, Kes's claws scraping against the floor and the faint, haunting echoes of gunfire reverberating through the narrow metal walls. The data drive clutched in her hands felt impossibly heavy, as though it contained the weight of every life in the galaxy. Kes halted abruptly, their silhouette a dark shadow against the faint glow filtering through tiny ventilation grates. The metallic scent of the air grew sharper, and Elena could hear their shallow, controlled breaths as they scanned the dim passage for unseen threats. There's a junction ahead, they whispered, their voice low and tense. One path leads to the vault, the other goes deeper into the maintenance system. Elena shifted uncomfortably, her muscles aching as the confined space forced her into an unnatural crouch. Her knees pressed sharply against the cold metal floor, and every movement felt like a struggle against the unyielding walls. Which way? She whispered back. Give me a moment. Kes tapped their datapad, the device's glow illuminating their face. Their frilled crest fluttered, a sign of concentration. Here. Right tunnel. But we need to move quickly. As they turned down the right-hand path, the sounds of the chaos above seemed to intensify. Shouts echoed faintly through the walls, followed by another distant explosion. Elena's heart pounded. She couldn't shake the image of Patel standing his ground against the insurgents, his determined expression etched into her mind. She hoped his sacrifice hadn't been in vain. The tunnel widened slightly, allowing them to crouch instead of crawl. Kes's pace quickened, their powerful frame moving with a grace that belied the tension in their movements. Elena struggled to keep up, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Just as she was about to ask for a brief pause, Kes raised a hand, signaling her to stop. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Kes sniffed the air, their golden eyes narrowing. "There's something ahead," they murmured. "Something alive." Elena's grip tightened on the data drive as she peered into the darkness. A faint, irregular sound reached her ears, a shuffling noise, accompanied by labored breathing. Her stomach clenched. "Do you think it's one of the insurgents?" "Possibly," Kes replied. "Stay behind me." They advanced cautiously, their movements silent and deliberate. The tunnel curved slightly, and as they rounded the corner, the source of the noise came into view. A figure slumped against the wall, their body partially obscured by shadows. They wore a security uniform, but the blood staining the fabric made it difficult to discern any insignia. Elena's breath caught. "They're hurt," she said, stepping forward. Kes held out an arm, stopping her. "Wait. We don't know if they're hostile." The figure stirred, their head lifting weakly, revealing a pale, sweat-soaked face streaked with grime. Blood dripped steadily from a jagged gash on their side, pooling beneath them. "Help me," they croaked, their voice rasping like sandpaper. Kes hesitated, their gaze flicking between the injured individual and Elena. Finally, they sighed. "Fine. But be careful." Elena knelt beside the figure, her hands shaking as she examined their injuries. A deep gash ran along their side, and their breathing was shallow. "We need to stop the bleeding," she said, pulling a small medical kit from her belt. As she worked, the figure's eyes fluttered open, their gaze focusing on her. "The vault," they rasped. "They're coming for it." Elena's blood ran cold. "How many?" "Don't know," they whispered. "But they'll stop at nothing." Kessa's claws scraped against the floor as they shifted uneasily. "We need to move," they said urgently. "If the insurgents reach the vault before us." Elena nodded, securing the makeshift bandage she had applied. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of responsibility. The injured figure's faint breaths reminded her of the lives depending on their success, fueling a renewed sense of urgency. "Can you walk?" she asked the injured figure. They shook their head weakly. "Leave me. Just stop them." Elena hesitated, her instincts warring with the urgency of their mission. Finally, she stood, her expression grim. "We'll send help," she promised, though the words felt hollow. As they resumed their journey, the tension in the air grew palpable. The tunnel sloped downward, the temperature dropping noticeably. Elena shivered, though she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the sense of foreboding that pressed down on her. The walls began to gleam faintly, coated in a thin layer of frost. "We're close," Kes murmured, their breath visible in the frigid air. "The vault should be just ahead." They rounded a final bend and came to an abrupt halt. The vault loomed before them, its massive steel doors sealed tight. A control panel blinked faintly beside it, its screen covered in a thin layer of ice. But it wasn't the sight of the vault that made Elena's stomach drop, it was the group of figures gathered before it. There were 5 of them, clad in dark combat gear and armed with advanced weaponry. Insurgents. They hadn't noticed Elena and Kes yet, their attention focused on the control panel as one of them worked to bypass the security measures. Kessa's crest flared slightly, their stance shifting into one of readiness. "We can't let them breach the vault," they whispered. "But there are too many to take head-on." Elena's mind raced. They had no weapons, no reinforcements, and no time. But they did have one advantage, the element of surprise. Her gaze shifted to a series of pipes running along the ceiling, frost clinging to their surfaces. The faint glint of frost caught her eye, triggering a sudden realization of their potential. Her mind raced, piecing together a plan even as the tension made her hands tremble. "What if we disrupt their equipment?" she whispered. "Those pipes might carry coolant. If we can rupture them, it could freeze their systems." Kes studied the pipes, their eyes narrowing. "It's risky," they said. "If the coolant is toxic, do we have another choice?" Elena countered. Kes didn't reply. Instead, they moved silently to the nearest pipe, examining it closely. There's a release valve here, they murmured. But we'll need to trigger it manually. I'll do it, Elena said immediately. Kes hesitated. Are you sure? She nodded, her jaw set. Just be ready to move. While Kes positioned themselves closer to the insurgents, Elena crept toward the valve, her breath shallow and her palms slick with sweat as the cold metal bit into her fingertips. Each step felt agonizingly deliberate, her ears straining to catch even the faintest shift from the insurgents ahead. She reached the pipe and gripped the valve, her hands trembling from the cold. Taking a deep breath, she turned it with all her strength. A deafening hiss filled the air as a burst of icy vapor erupted from the pipe. The insurgents shouted in alarm, their weapons and armor quickly coated in frost. One of them dropped their weapon, clutching at their helmet as the freezing coolant seeped through the cracks. Now! Kes roared, charging forward with astonishing speed. They barreled into the nearest insurgent, their claws flashing. Elena followed, adrenaline propelling her as she lunged for the control panel. She didn't know how to fight, but she could lock down the vault. Her fingers flew across the panel, entering the emergency override code Patel had given her. Behind her, the sounds of combat rang out, grunts, shouts, and the clash of claws against metal. Finally, with a soft chime, the vault doors sealed, their reinforced steel barriers sliding into place. The sudden quiet was broken only by the sound of Elena's ragged breathing and the faint hum of the locking mechanisms, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted moments before. Elena turned to see Kes standing amidst the incapacitated insurgents, their chest heaving. The icy vapor still hung in the air, and the floor was littered with weapons and unconscious bodies. Are you hurt? She asked, rushing to their side. Kes shook their head, though their scales were pale from exertion. I'm fine. But we need to move. They won't stay down for long. Elena nodded, her heart still racing. The mission wasn't over yet. Together, they turned and entered the vault, the massive doors closing behind them with a final, echoing thud. The vault's interior was colder than Elena had expected, the chill biting at her exposed skin and making her breath cloud in the dim light. The air hung heavy, carrying the low, resonant hum of dormant machinery that seemed to seep into her bones. The walls were lined with reinforced containers, each one housing research, samples, or technology deemed critical to the survival of countless species. As the heavy doors sealed behind them, a sense of fleeting security settled over her and Kes. Is it here? Elena asked, her breath fogging in the chilled air. Kes nodded, scanning the labels on the containers. Their claws hovered over a keypad embedded in one of the walls. The samples we need should be in compartment 17, they said. Let's hope the insurgents didn't tamper with the systems. Elena wiped her damp palms on her pants, stepping beside Kes as they input the code. With a soft hiss, the compartment slid open, revealing rows of vials suspended in protective foam. Each vial contained a biological sample, the building blocks of potential immunity, the galaxy's last hope to counter the devastation spreading unchecked. This is it, Kes said, their voice a mixture of relief and determination. We can use these to isolate the factor that makes humans immune. Elena reached for a vial, her hand steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her. We'll need to analyze these in a sterile environment. If we... The faint sound of a metallic clang interrupted her, sharp and jarring against the vault's low hum. Elena's pulse quickened, and she exchanged a tense glance with Kes, both instantly aware of the fragile barrier between them and the threat outside. Both she and Kes froze, their eyes darting toward the door. A tense silence followed, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the vault's systems. They're trying to breach the door, Kes whispered. Their crest flared, and they stepped forward, positioning themselves between Elena and the entrance. We need to secure the samples and prepare for an escape. Elena's mind raced. The insurgents would be relentless, and without reinforcements, their chances of holding the vault were slim. But the samples represented hope for the galaxy. Leaving them behind was not an option. There's an emergency hatch, she said, her voice low but resolute. It should lead to the lower tunnels. We can. The door groaned under the pressure of the insurgents' attempts to force it open, cutting her off. Kes glanced at her, their expression unreadable but their resolve clear. Take the samples. I'll hold them off, Kes said, their voice steady but tinged with a deep resolve. Their crest flared fully, and they planted their claws firmly on the ground, their stance radiating both defiance and a quiet acceptance of the danger ahead. A fleeting flicker of vulnerability crossed their golden eyes before they shifted into determined focus, ready to stand as a shield. "No," Elena said sharply. "We're not splitting up. We'll use the hatch together. I have a plan." Kes hesitated but nodded, trusting her instincts. Together, they secured the vials in a portable containment unit. Elena led the way to a panel on the far wall, her fingers flying over the controls. A hidden door slid open, revealing a narrow shaft that descended into darkness. "Go," Elena urged, handing Kes the containment unit. "I'll activate the failsafe." Kes's eyes widened. "The failsafe will lock the vault permanently. You'll be trapped." "Not if I time it right," she said with a faint smile. "Trust me." Reluctantly, Kes climbed into the shaft, their movements quick but burdened by the weight of the containment unit. Elena turned back to the control panel, her heart pounding. She initiated the failsafe sequence, her fingers trembling as she keyed in the final command. The vault's systems roared to life, the machinery vibrating as reinforced barriers began to deploy. The sound was deafening, but Elena's focus didn't waver. She darted toward the hatch, sliding into the shaft just as the final barrier sealed with a resounding thud. The descent was harrowing, the narrow shaft forcing them into an uncontrolled slide. The metal walls screeched against their clothing, and the cold air rushed past, stinging Elena's face. Each jarring bump and sudden lurch sent shocks through her body, her fingers scrambling to grip the slick edges for balance. The air grew colder as they descended, and Elena's fingers ached from gripping the edges of the shaft. When they finally reached the bottom, they tumbled onto the floor of a dimly lit tunnel. "Are you okay?" Elena asked, scrambling to her feet. Kes nodded, their crest fluttering weakly. "I've been better. But the samples are intact." Elena exhaled in relief. "Then we still have a chance." The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the tunnel, snapping them back to attention. The insurgents weren't far behind. Elena's mind raced, searching for an escape route. "This way," Kes said, pointing to a narrow passage branching off from the main tunnel. They moved quickly, their pace steady despite their exhaustion. Elena followed, her determination unwavering. The passage opened into a cavernous chamber filled with ancient machinery, its purpose long forgotten. The walls were lined with glowing conduits, casting an eerie light over the space. Kes stopped abruptly, their eyes scanning the room. "This machinery, it's Thranian," they said, their voice tinged with awe. "My ancestors built this." Elena glanced around, her curiosity piqued despite the urgency of their situation. "Can it help us?" Kes moved to one of the consoles, their claws gliding over the surface. The machinery sputtered to life, the conduits pulsing with energy. "If I can activate the defense systems, it might buy us enough time to escape," Kes said, their voice laced with both urgency and reverence. "These systems were designed by my ancestors to protect entire colonies. If they still function, they'll give us a significant advantage." Elena positioned herself near the chamber's entrance, her eyes fixed on the tunnel. The distant footsteps grew louder, the insurgents closing in. "Hurry," she urged. Kes worked with frantic precision, their movements fueled by a mix of desperation and determination. The chamber shuddered as ancient turrets emerged from the walls, their barrels swiveling toward the tunnel. Kes stepped back, their chest heaving. "It's done," they said. The first insurgent stepped into the chamber, their weapon raised. The turrets fired with ruthless efficiency, cutting them down before they could react. The remaining insurgents hesitated, their advance stalled by the unexpected resistance. "Let's go," Kes said, grabbing Elena's arm. Together, they slipped through a hidden exit at the back of the chamber, the sounds of combat fading as they put distance between themselves and the insurgents. The tunnel eventually led to the surface, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the stifling confines of the vault and tunnels. Elena and Kes paused, catching their breath as they surveyed their surroundings. In the distance, the faint lights of a United Earth Fleet outpost twinkled like beacons of hope. "We made it," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. Kes nodded, their gaze steady. But the fight isn't over. We have the samples, but turning them into a cure will take time. Elena's lips curved into a determined smile. Then we better get started. Together, they began the trek toward the outpost, their steps heavy with exhaustion but buoyed by the knowledge that they had secured a chance, however slim, to save the galaxy. The stars above seemed to shine brighter, as if offering their silent encouragement. For the first time in days, Elena felt a spark of hope.